Thank you, Anantha. It is such a privilege to be here. Through much of our careers, we have been scholars, but this feels like an opportunity to also be leaders in thought and to be leaders in policy, and to translate from what we have studied to what we can do with that knowledge. So it is really a privilege. And it is a privilege in that light to introduce Congressman Jake Auchincloss, who is serving in his third term representing the Massachusetts 4th. He serves on the House Committee on Energy and Commerce, where, among other things, he oversees AI policy. Jake was born and raised in Newton, Massachusetts, the son of a surgeon and a scientist. And also, he has loved history since the moment he learned to read. After graduating from Harvard College, he joined the Marines. He commanded infantry in Afghanistan and special operations in Panama. He now holds degrees in economics and finance from Harvard University and MIT Sloan. And he lives in Newton with his wife, Michelle, and their children, Teddy, Grace, and Audrey, and their Labrador retriever, Donut. Let me hand it over to Congressman Auchincloss.
Good afternoon. It's really an honor to be invited to help launch the Stone Center. I want to commend, first and foremost, Jim Stone for his far-sighted philanthropy. I consider Jim a friend and have always had really stimulating discussions and sometimes debates with Jim, and I've always come out learning more. And I appreciate his commitment to scholarship that informs public policy, and couldn't have picked three better founding directors than David, Darren, and Simon. I know all three. I know their work, and I have utmost respect for their scholarship and confidence that they can directly impact public policy. And I know that because they already are, because when I come across a tough question, I'm trying to see what they've written, and sometimes I'm even texting them or calling them already. Now, they're going to ask me some questions, so in that spirit, I'm going to ask them some questions in my brief remarks here, really three, that I hope the Stone Center will try to address as part of its far-ranging research. The first question I have is, where next? The story of the US labor market at a 100,000-foot level in terms of its value-added center of gravity has been farms, to factories, to offices, to where? And I find it telling that Mark Zuckerberg recently came out with this draft plan for a data center the size of Manhattan. And it's interesting because that Manhattan-sized data center is sort of a visual metaphor for a bet that a lot of these tech companies are placing on the future of knowledge work. Their view is that the future of knowledge work is done in a Manhattan-sized data center. The other theory of the case is, no, the future of work is done in Manhattan, right? Like in actual office spaces. And I don't know which bet turns out to be the right one, but what I think is clear is that there is going to be a fourth wave from farms to factories to offices to where? To the trades, to different kinds of offices, to entrepreneurship. And I think being able to fill in that blank about the movement of the US labor force then helps us ask follow-on questions like, number two, is it different this time? There's always a debate with a new technology about whether it is going to replace or augment the labor force, how dislocating it will be, how much there will be creative and how much there will be disruption. My bias has always been technology creates more jobs. And ever since it was people taking hammers to sewing machines, that the backlash against new technology generally has not been the right approach, and it's instead better to envelop it within the labor force to create more specialization, more commerce, more skills to augment and amplify humans. Maybe it's different this time. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe this really is something that's going to directly substitute in a way that's highly painful and dislocating, and we better be prepared for that. So directly addressing that question, or even trying to create it sector by sector. Hey, in this sector we think it's incredibly dislocating, in this sector we think it's more augmenting or amplifying. That would be very useful for policymakers to know, and we don't have a great theory of the case for it right now. And then the final one that I would ask the Stone Center is, okay, if we have a theory of the case about what's after offices, and if we have a theory of the case for which sectors is it dislocating versus which sectors is it amplifying, how do we want to do policy interventions? I'm informed here by your colleague over at Harvard, Danny Roderick's productivist framework, pre-production, production, and post-production for policy interventions. His theory being that pre-production, things like education and R&D, are about kind of preparing labor and capital for maximum productivity. Post-production is basically redistribution. And his argument has been pre-production and post-production are helpful but incomplete, and you actually want to have a productivist intervention about actual jobs being matched with employers and how to prepare those employees for maximum leverage and productivity. So in those sectors that we think are being super dislocated, in those sectors that maybe are going to be amplified, what are some good interventions across those three frameworks for policymakers to have maximum impact? Is it okay that I reference the Harvard policy? I know it's like but look, I read you guys more than I read him, I promise. But so those are the three questions I have, and again, I'm honored to be invited here for this keynote panel, and appreciate Jim Stone's far-sighted philanthropy, and excited to work with you three in the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to ask Congressman Auchincloss some questions, and then I'm going to turn it over to you to ask some questions. So this is a battle of the questions. I will not attempt to answer your questions right now, but hopefully throughout the day, we will produce some better answers. So let me ask you first in terms of your own constituency. Most public discussions on the economic consequences of AI focus on the risk it poses to jobs. Is that what you're hearing from your constituents as well? And if so, what do you tell them? Do you see opportunities as well as risks?
At a very coarse-grained level, it's generational. My older constituents don't tend to think that they are substitutable or replaceable by AI, and actually I think that the data largely supports that to date. They are worried about their kids, and their kids are worried about their kids, which is to say anybody who's got a new college grad, and those college grads are those 20-somethings themselves, I sense real heartburn about whether AI is going to substitute for what they trained to do, and understandably so. I don't pretend to have crystal clear, compelling answers, and I think you should run away from any politician who does. Politicians who claim that they create jobs or who have the answers to the job market, that is always something to be skeptical of. What I do say, though, is that we need to be driving towards a vision whereas people are above the API, not below the API. And what I mean by that is, if you look at TikTok, it's this massive struggle to be, most users of TikTok are below the API, which means the algorithm is controlling you. And then a few lucky people get above the API and they create content that gets disseminated broadly and they can accrue a lot of wealth from that. But it's a very, very asymmetric formula there. Very few people above the API driving a tremendous amount of wealth and influence, most people below the API really being used as pawns. You contrast that with like an Etsy, where I think most people are above the API. Etsy is something where you have producers and entrepreneurs using an algorithm, using a marketplace to create wealth for themselves. It's not like, massive wealth, but it's wealth that is meaningful and that creates a middle-class wage. And what I want is an end state of an Etsy economy, not a TikTok economy.
Well put, yeah. Using AI collaboratively rather than simply being automated by it. So let me now ask you about policy. So the policy debate on what, if any, AI policies the US should have is kind of a war zone. And I would say there's roughly three camps. One says, don't touch it. AI is our future, and you'll wreck it. Plus, China. The second camp says we need AI safety regulations and AI regulation generally immediately before the risks are realized and the tech companies are unstoppable. And the third camp says we need to adopt AI regulations yesterday, it's too late. So I wanted to ask you if you affiliate with any of those armies or if you have a different vision in mind.
I have a different vision in mind because I think 1 and 2 actually are kind of the same. What I mean by that is you get the massive tech lobby saying, don't touch it, or China will win, and that was very well paraphrased. That's literally exactly what they say.
China.
But number 2 is we'll do a lot of regulations. You know what the awkward truth is? Those regulations are actually incumbent protecting regulations that actually help the big monopolistic power players. And so depending on the audience they're talking to, they either say, don't touch it, or they say, yeah, we super need to regulate it, but P.S., let us write the regulations for it. I don't trust either of those. My view is any piece of legislation today that has the word AI in it runs the risk of being both too narrowly scoped and also quickly anachronistic. We should be focused on outcomes, not on specific technologies or processes. I'll give you a couple of concrete examples. United Health Group, the most influential health insurance company in America, is very, very good at using AI to deny prior authorization in health insurance, okay? If they're using AI to do it, or if they're using, if they're outsourcing that function to another country to do it with low-cost labor, I don't like it either way. I don't want them to just across the board deny prior auth as a way to reduce claims out. Like, they shouldn't do that. At the same time, if biotech is using AI to find new ways that proteins fold to discern new targets and new therapies, great. I think they should use it. I don't think the FDA should be regulating based on how the drug was come up with. They should be regulating on safety and efficacy. Good old tech-neutral, outcomes-based regulations. The place that we need to be, the place where we need to be most focused, though, on those outcomes is in the fusion of AI with social media. This is where things are going to get weird and dystopian real fast. And again, doesn't need to be AI specific. I'll give you an example. Almost all deepfake videos online right now, almost all, are non-consensual intimate privacy violations of young women. Whether you're doing that with a PowerPoint or whether you're doing that with AI, that's illegal, that's a tort. And these social media platforms need to be liable for that. And having a law, Section 230, drafted in the 1990s, that virtually holds them immune from any prosecution for tort law is a terrible idea. Now, AI is making that a more urgent problem to solve, but it's not AI specific. What's specific is you are liable for toxicity on your platform. We're going to see this with chatbots increasingly. They're now trying to claim that they're not liable for any chatbots and their chatbots interlocutions with young people. That's totally unacceptable. If you're hosting a chatbot, if you are promoting a chatbot, if you are platforming a chatbot, and that chatbot is having, as Meta has said it should, quote, sensual conversations with 12-year-olds. This is Meta's internal documentation for its engineers. Chatbots can have sensual conversations with 12-year-olds. You are liable for that.
So let me amplify one of the points you made on sort of not just trying to kind of stop what's happening, but shape where it's going.
Yeah.
And we deliberately call ourselves the Center on Inequality and Shaping the Future of Work because we believe that there are choices, and the choices are not just at the outcome stage of controlling what has happened, but really you might call the productionist stage of what are we actually doing. And we think there are constructive ways to use this technology. It's not just a matter of preventing it, it's a matter of harnessing it and using it in a way that is pro-worker, that promotes opportunity and also addresses consumer needs. And I know this is something you've thought about a lot. So let me actually queue up this question. So the brilliant name, and it really is a brilliant name, of your Substack is Simple But Not Easy. And this is where Congressman Auchincloss has very thoughtful ideas about where the opportunities and where we're headed. And so I was wondering if you wanted to kind of speak to one or two ideas that you see as potential in terms of simple, logical, but not easy to get there.
I appreciate it. I'm seeing John Gruber in the audience right now. John and I collaborated, he's the chair of the economics department here at MIT. He and I collaborated on a piece this summer about building new cities in the United States. And that is a simple but not easy idea. Simple in the sense that America used to build cities all the time. I mean, every time Americans bumped into a river, we would build a city there. But certainly not easy, especially these days with land use and other regulatory barriers. But I like it for three reasons: housing, energy, and cars. We are very short of housing in the United States today, probably 5 million short nationally, and about 250,000 short here in Massachusetts. In my view, there is no more pro-worker, pro-economic mobility intervention than to build a ton of housing. It is social infrastructure, and to make housing abundant and cheap is to give people the ability to move to where the jobs are, and also radically lowers the biggest cost driver in a family's budget, which is rent or mortgage payments. And there's a lot of good things that we can do with existing localities, but it's slow, including here in Massachusetts, where the MBTA Communities Act is probably going to get us 10 to 15% of where we need to be. So let's build a new city. Let's do it on state-owned land or decommissioned military bases and create a demand signal for the market to create a ton of housing fast. And some of that housing construction I expect will be done in a factory-built way using AI. And there are some companies here in Massachusetts that have software-first housing construction facilities where they're able to do high-mix, medium-volume housing design and production. It can be a way to bootstrap in some of these companies that are building in the real world using AI. Number two, energy. We need a ton more energy. MIT's The Engine has launched some of the most promising clean energy ventures out there. But again, they need demand signal and they need regulatory relief. New cities can do that. And then the final one is cars, which is to say, for the last 70 years, we've done this experiment as a country about single-use zoning paired with 2 cars on a lot. And what it's done is I think it's really driven us apart as a society. I'd like to experiment with new cities with pedestrian-centric infrastructure that actually exclude personally owned vehicles and create walkable civic cohesion.
So speaking of bringing us apart and bringing us together, you've made a point of meeting in person with organizations and individuals who are not your natural constituencies, such as the Boston College Young Republicans. And you've made clear that you think our public discourse has gone deeply awry, harmed by the rise of new media, of social media. Can you say a little more about what's gone wrong, and what, if anything, we can do to right that wrong, and why you're willing to debate, and I quote, almost anyone in real life offline touching grass?
I'm a touch grass populist. I think we've got to really take on these social media corporations that have become the wealthiest, most powerful corporations in the history of the world, hold themselves unaccountable to the publics that they're supposed to serve, and have been monetizing the attention spans of our children. And they have had a tremendously corrosive impact on our democracy. Media, in my opinion, media is upstream of culture, which is upstream of politics. If we want a better culture, and certainly if we want a better politics, we need a better media. And the problem is right now our media is an algorithmic thunderdome, as Ezra Klein called it yesterday, in which it's all about outrage as a service. It's just who can be more tribal, who can be more mean. It's making us all lonelier and angrier and sadder. And we have to deliberately and intentionally divorce ourselves from this Web 2.0 status quo that we're in. There's some good reasons for optimism on that front. One, if we think AI is a paradigm shift, paradigm shifts are when you get a reset of the equilibrium, that we can actually move to a different future for this. And number two is, I spent a lot of time with Gen Z in various capacities. They know that this is broken. They know that they are being treated as a product. And when I go to a middle school classroom or a high school classroom, I'll sometimes say, all right, everybody close your eyes, put your heads down, and raise your hand if you wish that TikTok or Instagram had never been invented. And not all the time, but most of the time, most of the hands go up. That tells me there's a different future that can be born here. But it's not, it requires intentional public and private action and entrepreneurship, which I'm committed to, which is why I'm trying to set that example myself by just engaging in real life.
Before we came here, I actually asked my undergraduate class how many of them use TikTok, and the majority claim not to. But then I also asked them how many who wished it didn't exist. And both among those who do and don't use it, a very substantial number wished it was not around, which suggests a problem, right? If we're all using a thing that we wish didn't exist, that's not a good equilibrium to be in.
It's a classic, tragedy of the commons sort of collective action problem, which requires a collective action solution.
Absolutely. Okay, so now I'm going to open the floor to questions from you. And raise your hand, and our drones will fly over and hand you a microphone. Oh, our staff will give you a microphone. Do we have? Okay, great. So right there is John Gruber, who's the department head in economics, and by law, he must ask the first question. Come on up, John.
Stone Center folks for rewarding the incredible work that's being done at MIT. And Jake, thank you for your leadership. I want to follow up on something that David asked and you started on, which is, where with AI now, sort of where with social media 25 years ago. If you go back 25 years ago, what would you have done differently? And how could that inform what we do differently now about AI? Because I think we should learn from that experience. We screwed up. How do we learn from that experience in terms of thinking what we should get right now, looking forward to AI?
It's a very thoughtful question. I think I'll give one incomplete answer, which is, I'll give two incomplete answers. The first is fundamentally treating social media differently than all previous forms of media. Because the previous forms of media, if your audience was N as a TV station, your impact was N. It was you reached that number of people with that number of interactions. With social media, if your audience is N, we're gonna have to find an MIT mathematician here, but it's like N factorial, or like N to the nth impact, the exponential impact of social media. At that point, it's a difference of kind, not just a difference of degree. This is the most powerful platform ever devised. And so I think just understanding upfront that it needs to be treated differently and that their claims to be simply utilities, to be simply content neutral piping is just fundamentally flawed. The algorithm is fundamentally editorial in nature. And to that end, giving them blanket immunity to tort law was a huge mistake. I understand the thinking about it in the 1990s when it was a bunch of blogs, but that was at a time when the internet was still being born. 30 years later, the internet's doing pretty good. It does not need that type of blanket immunity. And what we have to do is tap into the accumulated wisdom of the last 1,000 years of common law, which was over and over again, for literally 1,000 years, groups of 12 people got together and said, hey, that, you're not allowed to do that. That, you're not allowed to do that either. Edge case after edge case after edge case. And because we deprived ourselves of that very anti-fragile, very wise reservoir of human judgment, we've created this social media conflagration. And what we have to do is subject that platform to the accumulated generations of human wisdom, which is called tort law. We have a word for it. It's tort law, and they need to be subject to it.
Let me just add to the question. So like one thing schools have begun to do is ban smartphone usage during the day,
100%.
right? And it took so long to get there. And when it happens, schools say, oh my God, this is qualitatively different. But my older daughter's partner is a school teacher in the Newton Public Schools, and now they're grappling with AI. And he says, I teach an honors English class, and students who never in their life would have dreamed of cheating on anything they did will go home and write stuff using a chatbot and hand it in. He says, and like the Overton window is just like, it was unthinkable, and now it's commonplace. Yeah. And the question is, what is the disciplinary, what is the mechanism, right, that teaches us either the self-control or puts the guardrails in place? And I think there's so many kind of social diseases of form that kind of ravage through us before we learn how to control them, right? Obesity, drug use, pornography, even the opioid epidemic, which killed more than 500,000 Americans, is finally burning itself out. Partly that's regulation, but partly it's because of social learning.
Yeah, that's right.
And so, but we don't want to go through that again, right? We would prefer to learn quickly and minimize harm.
Well, and the age of adulthood right now for online interactions is 13. It's the age of internet adulthood. Not enforceable, by the way. Totally unenforceable in America. So it's functionally, there is no age of adulthood. That was another original sin of this whole enterprise. Should be at least 16, if not 18, and enforceable, because the adolescent brain is different, particularly the dopamine system and the prefrontal cortex. The way people make judgments, the way people seek reward and novel stimuli is different when their brain is developing, and that does deserve a tighter regulation.
Let's take another question, please. It turns out the drones are offline, so please stand up. But we're in the meantime. Let's see. Why don't we come to the microphone if you would? That would be so helpful. And a couple people can come forward. That's great.
Hi, thanks for being here. I like the idea of touching grass. I don't do enough of it.
Me neither.
There was a tweet this week from Michael Burry, who predicted the 2008 mortgage crash. indicating that he thought we were in an AI bubble, but that he didn't believe he could short the stock because the complicated financial agreements between the various AI firms means they're maybe too big to fail.
Yeah.
If that's true, and feel free to argue that, I guess I'm curious what levers then policymakers have to actually regulate AI, given how complicated the various tech major firms that make up the US market cap are relying on AI to succeed.
You're the economist, you know.
You know, I say let them fail. I don't think they're too big to fail. It'll be ugly, but it's mostly private venture money, and you know, they're adults. They can take these risks. I mean, you know, lots of people bought Pets.com back in 2000. It didn't work out so well for them, but we survived that. So I'm not nearly as worried about the AI bubble as many, because it's actually narrowly held. You know, it would be a big slowdown. So I think the real risk is much more the power of AI firms in politics, and you know how much voice they have. You know, and it's not that they are malevolent, but they have strong interests, and we collectively we also have strong interests, but they're very diffusely held about our privacy, right? About the use of our intellectual property, around you know, everything that's on the internet has, you know, been harvested in some sense, and you know, there was no compensation paid for that. So I don't think that's the ideal mechanism for distribution of this broadly held resource. So I worry about that a great deal.
I agree, and I think it ties into a flaw of US regulatory action over the last 2 decades, which is that we've been chasing these corporations as they shape-shift, and we've been using this antitrust law. And the challenge with using antitrust law for a lot of these corporations is that, defined sort of strictly, they create a lot of consumer surplus, right? Like the argument purely on price is relatively thin, and it's not actually what my constituents care about. My constituents don't care if Google has to share its browser data with Bing because of a court ruling. It doesn't affect their lives. What they care about is, are these corporations fracking their attention spans of their children? And so if that's what we care about, if it's a vice, then regulate it as a vice. Digital dopamine, whether it's online gambling or pornography or social media, this taking hostage of the dopamine reinforcement system, particularly young people. I don't care if that's a big company or a small company, a merged company, an acquired company. That's not the central thing to me. It's that we think that that's a bad thing, and we should regulate around what we actually care about, which is protecting people's neural autonomy.
Yeah, I mean, people like to say data is the new oil, but really it's attention that is the scarcest commodity. Yes, sir. And please just identify yourself as well when you ask the question.
Hello. I'm Vincent Abbott, PhD student at MIT, working on deep learning. But my question is for Jake. Do you sense in Congress that there is bipartisan agreement with respect to housing, construction, and NEPA deregulation? Or is this an exception to the polarization which we see in so many other things? And so, for example, policies, NEPA deregulation, tying federal infrastructure grants to states doing local zoning reforms, and so on. Is there more bipartisanship on this issue than what we see in politics as a whole?
Yes, I'm part of a caucus called the Build America Caucus.
Can you define NEPA for us?
Yeah.
For those of you who don't know what it stands for, not me.
1970s era law known as the National Environmental Protection Act, that was really a category-defining law about clean air, clean water, and bipartisan in inception, and really retained strong bipartisan support. Short answer is yes, and very bluntly, the framework that I always adhere to is it's not about high versus low, it's about fast versus slow. So what my constituents, I represent a very environmentally progressive district, and I'm an environmentally progressive lawmaker. What my constituents care about is high standards, clean air standards, clean soil standards, clean water standards. We don't want to go backwards. The Charles River was uninhabitable, unswimmable 50 years ago. You know, the New Bedford port, et cetera. These are success stories. People don't want to go back to that. There's a difference between high standards, though, and long approval times. We can have high and fast. That is totally possible. The original NEPA conception was 2 years to an answer. It's now taking 10 to 15. Not acceptable. We can't have this vetocracy of different litigation points embedded throughout the system. So I want high and fast, and I think we can get there, and there's bipartisan support for it.
Great. Please let us know who you are and ask your question.
Hello, thanks for being here. I'm a student at MIT, and this term I'm learning strategy, technology, sustainability, and globalization. And my question is around, you were mentioning about how AI is even prompting kids to cheat, right, which is pretty shocking. But then are we as policymakers, as the government, as we from the academia, doing something to kind of reframe how things have been taught in schools and in colleges? So for example, now at MIT, since I also TA, we say, yeah, you are free to use ChatGPT, but cite it, and if you're going to hallucinate with ChatGPT and you get the wrong answer, then you're responsible for it, which means we're empowering the students with ChatGPT, but then telling them you need to just use that as like, some support system, but still you need to do the thinking. But the school system right now, I don't think that is so advanced, which can challenge the students beyond ChatGPT. So if you're going to have the same set of questions, same set of syllabus, which has been there for like 50 years, then it's going to be getting pretty easy for the children. So my question is, as policymakers and as academics here, what should be the next steps towards changing this, thinking beyond science and math as silos, and what should be our next steps here? Thank you.
Yeah, this is a huge problem. I mean, in my undergraduate class, for example, I have these very long problem sets, and I hand them out, and I say, look, you could probably do a lot of this with ChatGPT, but then you won't be able to do the exam. And I've made it such that the problem sets, they don't count as much as they used to, and the exams count more. But of course, this is not an ideal system, and I think, this is another self-control issue, right? AI is great as a collaborative tool, right? If you don't have an AI chat window open while you're working and asking it questions to explain things to you and look things up, you're missing an opportunity. But if you're using it to think for you, you're missing the opportunity to learn. And how we teach people the discipline that learning is an effortful activity, that if it's easy, you're not learning anything, and if you don't learn anything, that's going to cost you in the long run. That's a very hard thing for a young person to take on board. And so I think I recognize the challenge, but I don't have an easy solution. But at least, yeah, that's a starting point.
At the K-12 level, I'll just point to two things that I know can be effective. One is ban the smartphones in schools, K-12, bell to bell, absolutely out of the school. And then number two is, and I've seen this in my own district, one-on-one live online tutoring as an intentional way to get kids back up to grade level for literacy and math is highly effective. And if you're intentional about the use of technology, it can be really empowering for those students and get them to a place where they can be proficient. But then you also have to be intentional about where it's not acceptable, right? Go back to pencils and blue books for a lot of learning, but then really lean into technology when it's like phonics instruction for a kid with dyslexia who's in first grade, where actually agentic tutoring can be incredibly meaningfully impactful. And so we need to give teachers and principals a lot more agency about how they lean into it, but then also say, we don't want it.
So this is great. We're actually down to the last 3 minutes. So I'm gonna take a question from yes, in the yellow sweater in the back, and just please ask your question, and then I'm gonna take the other two in front, and then we're gonna just answer as quickly as we can. So please, you in the back, yes. Oh, great, yeah. So you were up here first.
Yeah. Hi, Jake. David, my name is Carla. I'm a first-year MBA student at MIT. So my question, I wanna follow up on the conversation you were having on AI and regulation. So I think 2 points we all agree is that
quickly,
society is becoming more and more polarized with fake news and social media.
Yeah.
And second point, AI is being used by like almost everyone. You don't need, like, it's free and everyone can use it. So my question is, from a regulatory and political point of view, how can you ensure that bias that people don't bring their bias into the use of AI, especially in big corporations, government, and organizations that really make decisions that influence people's lives?
Great. So AI is a bias amplifier. Yeah. Go ahead. Let's take 2 more questions, then we'll respond if we can.
Hello. My name is John Sarushian. I'm a senior director at Americans for Responsible Innovation. My question's for the Congressman. What new political coalitions do you see emerging as a result of all these debates we're having on AI policy, both on the left and the right?
Great. So AI coalitions. Go ahead.
I'm Rivka. I'm a student at MIT.
First semester freshman.
Oh yeah. And my question was for Jake, and I was wondering, given that it is helpful for people under 18 to use the internet because they can meet people who have similar interests to them, and they can also there's a lot of information that they can learn from. Do you have any ideas for how to regulate minors' use of the internet without like taking away the gains that they can get from it?
Okay, so 2 questions on sort of proper use bias, and then 1 question on coalitions.
Wow, you're really throwing me some softballs here.
12
at the end.
seconds.
Yeah. So we don't have a blank sheet of paper on the use of social media by people under 18. The United Kingdom has done some good work on age-appropriate design. A big one would be no endless scrolling. So just full stop, you can't have the endless scroll. A mandatory reset of the algorithmic learnings every 30 days so that you can't drag people down rabbit holes. I can keep going, no targeted advertising. I have legislation that would allow parents to send age signals up through the firmware to the app store so that apps know how old the person is without knowing personally identifiable information about them. So we just need to be we have to do this stuff. None of it's perfect. In aggregate, it helps. In terms of embedded AI bias, without question, we're already seeing this. It used to be bot farms out of Southeast Asia that were driving amplification of material. Now it's just AI driven. This is going to get way, way worse. It's going to continue to fuse with politics, and we have to use this paradigm shift to decide that this is not what we want. And there's efforts. I'll cite one, the First Person Project, being spearheaded by Linux, that's really trying to think about a social network from first principles differently, that actually centers identifiable humans as the nodes rather than just anonymized, mostly bots at this point, online. Yes, there's a bipartisan drive in Congress. Ask me in 6 months whether I'm able to crystallize it into actual legislation, because I'm trying to push some Republicans to join me in legislation that frankly tries to bulldoze these social media platforms. And I think that this kind of touch grass populism can be something that mobilizes a lot of Americans across party lines, but I need some courage on the other side of the aisle.
Yeah. I mean, just said there are countries where you cannot post anonymously, right? Where you have to authenticate your ID, and that may seem like anathema, but there's a lot of virtues to that as well. So thank you all very much. Thank you, Congressman Auchincloss.
Pleasure.
This was really a pleasure. This is great.